Hello, good morning, and welcome to our special coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay in Lagos. The headlines. Ukraine holds Black Sea drills as markets expect grain, but Russia undecided about deal renewal. Ukraine detains Supreme Court chief in high-level corruption case. Plus, CIA video encourages Russians to make contact, while Russia says its special forces are monitoring the events. Thank you for joining us this morning. Ukraine's Border Guard Service published footage showing drills in the Black Sea near the port city of Odessa. Guardsmen trained with anti-aircraft guns and fired machine guns at floating targets. The drills comes after talks between Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the United Nations on extending a deal allowing the safe export of Ukrainian grain via the Black Sea due to expire on May the 18th. Meanwhile, the Kremlin said that questions still remained about Russia's part of the Black Sea grain deal and that it would have to make a decision about whether to renew it. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters contacts on the subjects were continuing. Ukraine is a major global exporter of grain. The export agreement, brokered by the UN and Turkey last July, has allowed Ukraine to transport millions of tons of food despite the ongoing conflict. It was agreed to help tackle the global food crisis after access to Ukraine's ports in the Black Sea was blocked by Russian warships following the invasion in February 2022. Russia and Ukraine have claimed to have made military advances against each other, with Russia saying its forces destroyed a Patriot missile defense system in Kiev, and Ukraine saying its troops repelled Russian attacks on multiple fronts. Russian Defense Ministry said the Russian military had used long-range, high-precision weapons to launch strikes targeting deployment points of Ukraine forces and warehouses storing ammunition, weapons, and other equipment provided by Western allies. According to the ministry, Russian air defense forces intercepted missiles fired by the HIMARS multiple rocket launching system, as well as multiple HARM anti-radiation missiles and STROM Shadow cruise missiles. Russia's counterattacks also included shooting down of a Su-24 fighter jet and an Su-25 fighter jet off Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukrainian Ministry of Defense says fighting continued unabated in the east as Ukrainian armed forces repelled dozens of Russian attacks in the past 24 hours in Krasny Liman and Bakhmut directions. It adds that the Ukrainian Air Force and the rocket artillery units carried out strikes on a series of targets, including Russian military personnel and equipment concentration areas, anti-missile systems, ammunition depots, and radio equipment, and seized control of a fuel depot. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked everyone who worked towards Ukraine's air defense system, saying the U.S. Patriot missile system was unreal. Ukraine said it had shot down 6 Russian Kentaur missiles in a single night, thwarting a weapon Moscow touted to be a next-generation hypersonic missile that was all but unstoppable. President Zelensky said that time, energy, arguments, meetings had gone into the effort to build their air defense capabilities. It was the first time Ukraine had claimed to have struck an entire volley of multiple Kentaur missiles, and if confirmed, will be a demonstration of the effectiveness of Kiev's newly deployed Western air defenses. Ukrainian prosecutors say they've arrested the head of the country's Supreme Court over an alleged bribery case a day after releasing photos that appear to show stacks of American $100 bills lined up on a couch found during an investigation involving its justices. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau did not name the person arrested, only that it was the head of the court and that they were suspected of taking a bribe worth $2.7 million and the highest profile discovery in the agency's history. Now, the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is Vsevolod Nyaziv, who could not immediately be reached for comment, although the Supreme Court says it's fully cooperating with the investigation and has initiated a process for expressing no confidence in Nyaziv. The Anti-Corruption Bureau said it was investigating what it called large-scale corruption at the court. Ukraine has historically had issues with corruption and has redoubled efforts to clamp down on it, that is, despite the war with Russia. Anti-corruption efforts are also central to its bid to join the European Union. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, published a video on its official YouTube channel, encouraging Russians to make contact via a secure internet channel. The short video in Russian was accompanied by a text saying the agency wanted to hear from military officers, intelligence specialists, diplomats, scientists, and people with information about Russia's economy and its leadership. Now, during the Soviet era, talking in whispers was the only possible way to criticize the government. And now, published nearly 15 months into Moscow's war with Ukraine, the video invites Russians to take a colossal risk. Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned his compatriots to be on their guard against traitors, and Parliament last month voted to increase the penalty for straight treason from 20 years to life in prison. Meanwhile, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said he had not paid attention to the YouTube video encouraging Russians to make contact with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, adding that he is convinced that Russian special services were tracking Western spy activity. Mr. Peskov said in his words, "Our special services are monitoring this space in the necessary way." He added that we all know perfectly well that the CIA and other Western intelligence services are not reducing their activity on the territory of our country. Kazakhstan Energy Minister Almasadam Satkaliyev said that Kazakhstan and Russia have established a route for a future gas pipeline to support shipments between the two countries and to China. The pipeline will help Russia boost sales in Asia while ensuring that Kazakhstan secures supplies for its central, northern, and eastern regions. The energy minister said the conditions for the construction of the gas pipeline are being discussed. Russia has been discussing a possible gas union with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan to support shipments between the three countries and other energy buyers. Now, we'd like to talk to Professor Dennis Soltis, Department of Public Administration and International Development at the Kimep University in Almaty in Kazakhstan, who joins us from Kazakhstan. It's good to have you with us this morning.
Nice to see you too.
Let's begin with our last story but one. This video from the CIA purportedly inviting Russians to make contact. Is this an unprecedented move by the CIA? Because this is actually encouraging Russians to spy against their government, knowing how the Putin administration treats dissidents.
Well, no, that's standard procedure. You always are trying to find in the target country people who will come forward with information, because you don't want to rely just on satellite, imagery or electronics, because you can never be sure what you're seeing or what's valid there. So you always want to get some live reportage from live people. I'll in the spy world, I'm not an expert in the spy world, but I think in the spy world, everything is fair. This is what countries do.
Yes, that. But now that just seems to put paid to any sort of, in their diplomacy between the United States and Russia. We know that there are Russians still in the United States. We know how hardline the United States is against the Russian invasion. But this effectively, doesn't this take up the enmity between both countries a notch?
Well, yes, it does. These are, competing, superpowers. So, they're playing hardball. It's a test of power. It's a test of will.
Now let's move to another issue that I think is beginning to become the elephant in the room, and that is this counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. Now, because it's been talked about for so long, and it hasn't happened yet. And one of the reasons that President Zelensky was given for this is that in some cases there'll be too many casualties for certain reasons. How much of a factor do you think the training of the personnel for the flurry of equipment that they have been promised and have been received is affecting the counteroffensive? Because, for instance, during World War II, training for the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, training alone, they lost about maybe 43,000 aircraft. And that was just due to training alone and even operational accidents. Now we hear that the UK and the Netherlands are speaking of providing the Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets. So, and all these other weapons that they've been promised and have received needs a lot of training.
Right. I'm not sure what your question is, but yeah, so training is very important. Well, again, and I'm not a military expert, I'm just citing what other military experts say, but weapons, without training aren't, particularly useful. In Ukraine's case, they've until now had weapons that are inferior to the Russian ones, but their training is better. And so this is, so the training largely in itself has, enabled the Ukrainians to do well. Also, we can talk about air defense here. It's only very recently, or relatively recently, that Ukraine has been receiving modern, fully up-to-date anti-aircraft systems. They've been working with, for quite a long time, or up until now, with their own traditional S-300s, which are about, third generation or second generation. But they've been very effective, and the reason for this is said to be their practice and training. Their anti-air effectiveness over the last year has increased significantly. Oh, and we just saw evidence of this just 1 or 2 days ago when the Russians simultaneously sent 18 missiles, of which 6 were these Kinjal daggers, hypersonic. There was 1 knocked out a few days ago, and then 6 all at once here. This is the first time that the Patriot missile has ever, or any missile anywhere in the world, has knocked down a hypersonic missile. And the Ukrainians, knocked down 6 of them, 18 for 18, because there were 12 other missiles, all aimed at the same time. They knocked out 6 of them. So this speaks also of the quickness of the Ukrainians to learn how to operate these very sophisticated Patriot missiles. So the same thing applies, to ground forces also. Training is very important.
Dmitry Peskov has denied that number of those particular missiles were shot down, the hypersonic ones, saying that they exaggerated the number. Do you think is he lying?
Who was Peskov?
The Russian spokesperson. He says that Ukraine misled with information as to the number of missiles that were shot down, that they didn't use that many missiles in that particular case, although he didn't say whether it was those missiles that indeed were shot down.
Well, I guess it's a case of he said, she said. Well, CNN also said, 6 missiles were shot down, so they were, using their own information sources. I wouldn't believe anything, that comes out of the Kremlin anyway.
I'm wondering.
They say all kinds of things.
That's understandable. I'm wondering what you make of this allegation that has come out of the leaked documents of the Pentagon that is purported to say, if you've heard it, that the Wagner Group mercenary chief, Prigozhin, was offering clandestinely a deal to Ukraine for Ukraine to give up their positions in Bakhmut so that he will give up Russia's positions on the front line, give them information on certain Russian positions.
Well, the Ukrainian side, almost certainly wouldn't go for this because, as one Ukrainian general or officer said, this would be, a breach of officer's honor. That is, for the Ukrainian army to negotiate with, a war criminal. You just don't do that. Also, there's a practical consideration that the Ukrainians, Prigozhin wouldn't be able to tell the Ukrainians anything they don't know already, because they have very good satellite and electronic information from their allies, satellite and electronic information. Also, people on the ground. Ukraine is, the Ukrainians are fighting within their own country, so they have drones flying all over the place. They also have partisans in all occupied territories who are also passing along information. So at a practical level, I don't think Prigozhin would be able to offer anything of value anyway.
Professor Soltis, now we're at this stage of the war, 447 days, I guess, of this conflict. What's your impression of the flurry of support from the nations that are supporting Ukraine weapon-wise?
Well, that's a good question. And the big event of this last few days was Volodymyr Zelensky's quite successful visit to the European countries, Britain, Germany, France, and Italy. All of them have agreed to continue to supply, high sophisticated weapons, and Germany has budgeted 2.7 billion euros for immediate, I guess, military aid. This is targeted specifically for military aid. So this is quite a departure also from Germany's traditional sort of policies about supplying weapons to areas where there is combat going. So this seems to indicate that these countries, the West, is very firmly behind now the Ukrainian war effort. For the longest time, there was prevarication. They were intimidated by the nuclear threat. Maybe they still are. But this seems like clear evidence that the Western countries remain committed, or are even increasingly committed to Ukraine's defense and, I guess, her victory. Here also, I think it's worthwhile to mention that the Western countries are, concerned or afraid that the international, security arrangement and post-war borders are in danger of being redrawn. And that would open up a whole Pandora's box. Also here related is, and a part that plays, or consideration here is that they're no longer distinguishing between Ukraine or Taiwan, defending one or the other, but Ukraine and Taiwan. So these two theaters are linked. So it seems that the Western countries, are convinced that they must or enable Ukraine to win, so that this will have a further deterrence on China's claims to Taiwan. So the stakes are very high. And in regard to your kind of earlier question, there's a lot of anticipation as to how the offensive will go. We can pretty well take we know pretty well what the performance of the Ukrainian army will be like. It will be good. But there are imponderables, at least two big imponderables on the Russian side, and that is the morale of the Russian soldiers and the actual effectiveness of their defenses. Their defenses are long, considered by military experts, and I'm not a military expert, that the defenses are stretched out too long and they're too thin. And so the Ukrainians, in one view, then would be able to punch through somewhere and get in behind the Russian lines, and then we'd see what happens.
It's interesting you bring up the Taiwan.
War is very uncertain. Sorry?
No, please go on. Okay, so you bring up Taiwan, but China just sent an envoy, is sending an envoy to put teeth to their earlier position now that they want peace between Ukraine and Russia. Sending of the Chinese envoy, does that in any way, obviously it shows that, does it seem to show their sincerity in this case, even though it is known that they're a Russian ally? Does it show their sincerity in trying to bring a solution that will benefit both parties? Also, knowing, and does that affect in any way their position with their intentions concerning Taiwan?
The short answer is no. The consensus or the majority opinion of the generals, Western ones, Ukrainian ones, and Russian television also, is that the Ukrainian offensive will be successful, or perhaps even very successful. Nobody knows for sure, but that is a possibility. And China knows this. So China, I think, is hedging its bets. It probably also thinks that the offensive will be successful. So that's why they're anxious for a peace. They don't want, so they have kind of an instrumental interest here. They don't want their ally or vassal, however you want to represent Russia, to be defeated as they are in the field, as they might be. So there's now a big, kind of diplomatic offensive by China, joined also by perhaps the Pope and the Vatican. Certain voices are trying to freeze the conflict. So I think China here has just a pragmatic calculation here to try to freeze the conflict so that its ally Russia is, not put in a bad light or in a great disadvantage, because that would reflect badly on China itself.
When you say that it's very likely that they will be successful in their offensive, that is Ukraine. Does that mean that we're taking Russia for granted? Have they thrown everything they can at Ukraine, even though we know that they're not doing as well as they intended to do?
Yes, the consensus is that Russia has lost its offensive capacity on the ground. It can still fire, as we see, missiles and try to use aircraft, but their positions now are in most sections of the front. On the south, the longest section is purely defensive. Although still for political reasons, because Putin wants this, they continue to try to make advances against Bakhmut and other areas in the north, but those are going badly for the Russians also.
Now, let's see this peace mission that is being proposed by some African leaders. We understand that African leaders, including South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, are considering putting together a peace mission from Africa, where we are at the moment. Do you think this will be influential?
No, I don't think either Russia and certainly Ukraine doesn't want this. And Ukraine cannot agree to this. As long as Russian forces are in the Ukrainian territory, Ukraine will never go for, the government will not agree to this. And more than that, the civilian population would not agree to this. So from the Ukrainian side, this is a non-starter. They told this, Zelensky made this clear, the government made this clear when China came out with its 12-point plan, several weeks ago. This is a non-flyer. Russia also, the Kremlin, Putin also think they can eventually wear down Western support. So they're not in the mood for negotiating either. So so the situation, it won't be settled politically or diplomatically. It has to be settled, unfortunately, on the field of battle. And here, as I say, the Ukrainians are optimistic, but one can never be sure. In war, things go wrong. The opponent also is smart, has, tricks up their sleeves. So, but in the meantime, as I say, the betting sort of seems to be that the Ukrainians would make significant advances. And so this has kind of caused, I think, this diplomatic scramble, or this diplomatic peace scramble, I would say, but I don't think it'll amount to much.
Now, the Kazakhstan energy minister said Kazakhstan and Russia have established a route for a future gas pipeline to support shipments between the two countries and to China. What's your impression of this?
Oh, Well, Russia has always tried to get control of pipelines and upstream supplies, fields of gas, and it's been, quite successful at that. But the ultimate market, yes, is China. And China is in a monopsony position, that is, single seller, single buyer. And as we've seen, China has been able to get about a 30% discount on Russian gas just because Russia has no place else to sell its gas. So getting a little bit more gas or pipeline capacity through Kazakhstan, well, okay, it might cause more gas to be shipped, but the price will not be higher.
Finally, Mr. Soltis, there's a concern that some of the sanctions that are being engineered against Russia are not being maybe as effective as first thought. For instance, in the case of Germany, where there are sanctions against supplying Russia with trade with Russia, but their support has increased with countries surrounding Russia, including Uzbekistan. I'm not sure about Kazakhstan. And in a third-party way, these same goods not getting to Russia directly will get to Russia indirectly through Russia's neighbors. Is this a valid concern?
Well, okay, Russia can always, a sanctioned country can, always find some or even substantial ways to get around sanctions. So yes, they can continue to sell their oil and gas through, third countries, and maybe limited amounts of, second-rate technology. But where the sanctions hurt the Russians the most are in the areas of high technology for their military industry. So this has been quite effective. There are always people who say, well, sanctions are not effective. Yes, they are. At the very least, sanctions spoil the investment climate and cause capital flight. This then causes a lower aggregate demand and then higher unemployment, inflation, all of these things. The sanctions are working. Sanctions don't work immediately, but they've been in place now for what? Well, various kinds for a year and longer already, going back from 2014. So these do have a cumulative effect. And, I've read some reports that by about fall, the Russian economy, the banking system or the country will be out of money. They will be, bankrupt in one view. So sanctions are taking a while to work. And, well, economists, I'm not an economist either, are saying, they're generally, having a considerable effect.
And finally, it's pretty certain that the uranium purchase from Russia by the United States, which the U.S. Senate is considering sanctions as well, will definitely hurt Russia because of the amount of money involved in that respect. But thank you so much, Professor Dennis Soltis of the Department of Public Administration and International Development, the Kimep University in Kazakhstan, for your contribution this morning.
My pleasure. Be well.
You too. After the break, the United States expresses cautious support for African peace mission. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby says the U.S. will support any third-party proposal to end Russia's war in Ukraine as long as it can be seen as credible, enforceable, and sustainable. It comes as South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said that Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky had agreed to meet a group of African leaders to discuss a potential peace plan for the conflict. Mr. Kirby says the Ukrainians have to be 100% behind it, adding that it has to start with the UN Charter being a foundational element, and it has to start with President Zelensky's support and his 10-point proposal being a part of that framework. Ukrainian soldiers say 4 Raider drones sold over the counter for $300 can be deadly enough to destroy Russian tanks once they have been modified to carry explosives. Speaking in the Central Eastern region, of Dnipropetrovsk, a soldier who goes by the call sign Petrov, says that, in his words, we have destroyed enemy tanks, heavy military equipment, personnel. It's a very effective gadget. The soldier fights for Ukraine's 35th Marine Brigade. It modifies commercially available drones and uses them to attack Russian forces and occupy swathes of Ukraine's east and south. Drones have been used extensively by both Moscow and Kiev's forces since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February last year. Ukraine has said it's expanding its drone program for both reconnaissance and attacking enemy targets in order to narrow the gap between the military capabilities and those of Russia. Hungary did not approve the disbursement of the next tranche of military support for Ukraine provided under the EU's European Peace Facility. Now, the EPF, created in 2021, is an off-budget instrument aimed at enhancing the EU's ability to prevent conflict, build peace, and strengthen international security. The EU has provided a total of about 3.6 billion euros for military support for Ukraine so far under the EPF. Hungary has been in a dispute with Brussels as the bloc has suspended any payments of EU recovery funds until Budapest's national government implements reforms to improve judicial independence and tackle corruption. Ukraine and Russia will face off before the United Nations top court on June the 6th, when judges will hear Ukraine's claims that Moscow violated the UN treaty by supporting pro-Russian separatists who were ignited by a Dutch court as being responsible for the 2014 downing of the flight MH17. In November last year, a Dutch court convicted 2 Russian men and Ukrainian nationals in absentia of murder for their role in the shooting down of the plane, the flight MH17, with the loss of about 298 passengers and crew and handing them life sentences. Now, Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 departed from Amsterdam and was bound for Kuala Lumpur when it was shut down over eastern Ukraine on July the 17th, 2014, as fighting raged between pro-Russian separatists and Ukrainian forces, the precursor of this year's conflict. The Dutch ruling also found that Russia had overall control over the forces of Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine from mid-May 2014. The International Court of Justice, as the World Court is formally known, has set 4 days of hearings on June the 6th, the 8th, the 12th, and the 14th to hear both sides in the case. South Korea's presidential office said Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, has met with the South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol as a special presidential envoy. Zelenska, the wife of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, is visiting South Korea to participate in a media conference. In an interview with South Korea's Yonhap news agency, Mrs. Zelensky expressed willingness to invite Yoon to her country, saying such a visit will be very supportive to Ukrainians. She also warned against the risk of war fatigue and called for more radical support for Ukraine to fight against Russia's aggression. South Korea, a major producer of artillery shells, says it was not providing lethal weapons to Ukraine, citing its relations with Russia. Spoke to Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain, national defense, and a military strategist, who joins us from our Abuja studio. It's good to have you with us this morning.
Thank you, and good morning.
Let me start from a military perspective, and it's concerning what may be like a trivia, given your background. We know that conscripts are playing a large part of this conflict. We know that Russia historically has always used conscripts in its army, the historical Red Army that fought in World War II, and the fact that many of them were conscripts from the United Soviet Republic, the USSR. And in this case, they're using mercenaries now in this particular war, as well as their conscripts. So is there an argument, if in the event that you had to command a battalion of soldiers who happen to be mercenaries or conscripts, who would you rather, who's more reliable of the two?
Well, that is like choosing between the sea and the ocean and the deep blue sea. None of the two options are good options. But it's even worse to go with mercenaries, because mercenaries don't follow the normal conventions. You know, in international conflict, there are some established conventions that states we have to follow. That is why it's more preferable, and in compliance with international laws, to make sure that you don't have non-state actors in conflict zones as the one you see in Ukraine, because they are not legally bound by those international conventions, particularly the Geneva Convention. Now, having said that, the conscripts, it depends on how they are being deployed. In this instance, if they are being deployed as part of the Russian military, that can be acceptable to some extent under international laws, because they are now working for a state actor rather than non-state actor, as is the case with the mercenary group, the Wagner group. There are two bad options. The reason why the conscript is bad option is because you're more like sending them to go and commit suicide. I've been following the events in Russia and how those conscripts are being deployed. They don't have the necessary training to be able to fight as a formidable force. And so in most cases, they have paid the ultimate price because they are not properly trained. And even with the little training they've gotten, they are not properly equipped to be able to defend themselves. So it's more like sending them to go and commit suicide.
Are you concerned about the ability of Ukraine to meet their targets of boots on the ground, given that Russia has a much bigger population, a bigger army?
You know, I can tell you that everything about Ukraine has surprised, me in particular. At the start of this conflict, one would have thought that the Russian armed forces would have overwhelmed the Ukrainians and, make their core objectives, which they stated initially when they invaded the country. I am surprised to see that the Ukrainians are still, fighting up to date. So one cannot overlook or ignore the resilience of the Ukrainian people. So I won't be surprised that they will have enough manpower to continue to fight this war, which they have considered as a patriotic war for themselves, to recover their territory. So I won't be surprised if they continue to fight, if they continue to have enough manpower to be able to continue to prosecute this war.
The peace mission being proposed by, or being mentioned by, the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, to which he says the Ukrainian president have agreed to meet with African leaders. Our guest that we just spoke with before we spoke to you is dubious of how far that will go in being successful, saying that they'll have to maintain Ukraine's position, and Russia obviously will not yield to it. Do you think this meeting, this mission, will be in any way influential? As
it stands right now, Africans are the only people with the credibility to wade into this conflict and be able to resolve it. Now, the sticking point is going to be the position of the Ukrainians and the position of the Russians. They will be able to accept whatever is put on the floor by African leaders, because almost every part of this world, most of those major countries have either directly or indirectly aligned themselves to one party or the other, except Africans, maybe with exception of South Africans that have made some comments in the past that seem to align with the Russians. But generally, African leaders had maintained strategic neutrality in this conflict. And with that strategic neutrality, they are better positioned than any other part of the world to be able to come in with, with that kind of a position that gives them credibility and integrity to be able to weld into this conflict. From the start of this conflict, Africans refused to take part with any of the parties, to take side with any of the parties. For quite obvious reasons, we're facing numerous challenges in Africa, and the leaders of Africa, rightly so, have determined that the solution to the various challenges that are being faced by the people of this continent will come from different places and different blocks. And so they had no strategic interest in supporting any of the parties. And so they placed themselves in a position of strategic neutrality, which they can, exploit now to weld into this conflict. Now, whether or not they will achieve anything remains to be seen, because you can see that all parties are fighting, are at the extreme end of their demands. The Ukrainians are insisting that they will have to take over the control of all of their territories, including Crimea. And I don't know how possible that will be. So that would be the only issue, is whether or not the parties involved in the conflict will be able to accept whatever proposals the Africans are able to put on the table. But as far as integrity and credibility, they are the only people with that credibility and integrity to weld in this conflict.
As the battle rages in Bakhmut and Russia holds on to those territories that it seized, including the ones with self-proclaimed independence from Ukraine, saying they want to be with Russia, Ukraine has consistently said that it's going to continue to stand in its position. For instance, the shooting down of the hypersonic missiles, which Russia has boasted of. They're hypersonic, 5 times faster than the speed of sound, but that they've been shot down by Ukraine's defense systems, probably using the US Patriot missile systems. Can you give us an insight into how much of a factor these weapons that Ukraine are getting now from their allies will play in bringing this offensive from Russia to an end?
Well, I don't know that it will bring the offensives from Russia to an end. But what I can tell you is that with these new weapon systems that the allies have provided to the Ukrainians, they have greatly improved their capability. Before now, the type of missiles that were being supplied to the Ukrainians were just short or medium range missiles. The maximum of is about 50 kilometers. Now you have these storm shadows that the British have provided to them that will travel 3 times more than that capability they have. It means that the Ukrainians can stay very far away from the front line and be able to launch these missiles, particularly into those eastern areas, the Luhansk and Donbass, that they have insisted that they will want to take over. So it greatly improved their capability. And with that kind of capability, we expect that they will put more pressure on the Russians, particularly in those regions. And who knows what will happen next. But sure, the more capability the Ukrainians get, I think we've seen how effectively they've been able to utilize most of the equipment that is being provided to them. If they continue to utilize it in that same way, we won't be surprised that the Ukrainians will achieve a significant we make some significant progress in those regions that they have considered as their utmost target.
You mentioned at the beginning of your submission that you were surprised, as many people also were, at Ukraine's resilience and performance in respect of the fact that Russia is perceived as a greater military power. Now that this has gone this far and taken this long, President Putin seems to have a dilemma in his hands with support for the war in his country. We understand that's why he's making use of the Wagner mercenary group. We understand that's why more people are being conscripted, of which there are many draft dodgers in Russia. People are leaving the country, not wanting to be a part of the war. Do you think that there is sentiment shifting in Russia against President Putin?
Well, let me tell you, there has never been any military conflict that is won without the support of the population. I don't know about Russia because Russia is not a democracy, but in most democracies, most conflicts are won by the support of the people. Now, there seem to be, some kind of dissenting voices within Russia, and particularly the oligarchs who are beginning to voice concerns about the invasion, saying that their fortunes, have dwindled at the course of this conflict. So if those dissenting voices continue to increase, I have no doubt that it will have some impact on Putin's ability to continue to forge ahead with this war. But I don't think those dissenting voices are coming to that level as a result of the crackdown within the Kremlin. And so, but, who knows? As time goes on, those voices could increase and become a serious problem for Putin to continue to prosecute this war.
Indeed, and those oligarchs are having their property seized all over the world. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain and national defense and military strategist, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, when we return, Ukraine calls on figure skating body to impose full Russian ban. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion. The Athletes Commission of the Ukrainian figure skating. Before we go to that story, let's join our business correspondent, Edie John Mekwa, who's with us for the last shift.
You wanted to dump me today.
Yeah, I wanted to jump the gun, but then I changed my mind.
You changed your mind.
I was like, okay, let me just consider you.
Okay, thank you.
Anyways, sorry about that. Now, welcome to the program again. And the last ship leaves Ukraine under the grain deal. Even at this last hour, it's still being hoped that Russia will change their minds. Can you fill us in on what's happening?
Yeah, it's still being hoped, but even the United States have said that, well, they are not stopping Russia from exporting their fertilizer and their food. So, I mean, it seems... it doesn't look like a meeting point, that there's a meeting point at this point. And, long before now, like from the 4th, the JCC, that's the Joint Coordination Center, they are the ones who approved the ship. There's a lot of paperwork to be done. So they had already stopped by May the 4th, because obviously these things, we're talking of ship, you're talking of logistics, it takes a lot of time through insurance and a lot of companies and individuals involved. So they had already stopped approving ship for going through that route, the Black Sea, under the grain deal, because they weren't sure. So it's looking even Russia now has stopped approving, I think from yesterday or so. So the last ship leaves today, Wednesday, goes through the process. Obviously, this ship had already gone through the process, aside the processes long before now. So it doesn't look like there's a meeting point at this time, and it ends tomorrow, which is less than 24 hours. Very, very, dangerous for global food security, because just between July last year and now, when this deal was struck by all of the parties, Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine, UN, and all of that, about 30 million tons of grain has been shipped through that, going to countries like Ethiopia, like Kenya. We remember then there was a crisis erupted in Egypt. There were riots because their mainstay is bread, which has to do with wheat. And when the price skyrocketed, a lot of countries did feel that impact. So now we don't know what's going to do. It's even affecting the humanitarian services of the World Food Programme, because they also benefit from this for countries like Yemen and all those countries in war. So where will they get all of this is a big question that we hope that both Russia especially Russia at this time, would consider, because the United States is insisting that Russia is still exporting their food and fertilizer, so they do have no reason to ask for extra condition before it is the grain deal is being renewed. You know, so that's why the United States thinks that there's no need to change any condition. Let's just have things as they have been, since Russia is still doing its export, but obviously Russia sees things otherwise, and they're not ready to back down. So, I mean, it leaves the world, global food chain and global food supply at a very risky stage again.
So the Germany gas plan, who used to get a lot of gas from Russia, now, what's happening now? Yeah,
so now it looks like they're turning to countries like Morocco to get gas that will be shipped through the sea in the form of hydrogen, obviously for the electricity. So we know that the weather didn't get as bad as they envisaged, because they had thought it was a scary time during winter and everything like that. So we saw the price go up, and they had very tight rules to usage for electricity and energy, heating and all of that. Well, it's a bit down now. There's a little bit of ease, but obviously they're looking to the long term. So now they're talking about issues of importing gas through hydrogen through the sea from countries like Morocco to help them for the long, and it's being projected that by 2030 they should be importing between 50 and 70% of the gas that they'll be using, you know, and well, countries like Nigeria could benefit from that if we had the infrastructure.
We could benefit from that if we had the infrastructure. But do you think that it'll affect, in the short term, is affecting Germany?
Yes, of course, it's affecting them. They've had to be on their toes, even though it's a bit eased now. But even with that, energy prices have gone up. Inflation is still up, you know, in those countries, more than what they thought it to be for this year, when people did not know that the issue of war will come up, you know, although the threat of recession has kind of eased for them, you know, but the energy cost is still high, and the government still has to be on their toes. That's why they're looking for new ways to sustain the supply of gas. Unfortunately, at some point, they even had to go back to coal, which is the dirtiest of all source of energy, you know, and they had a plan before now. Even though they've insisted they're going to stick to their plan of weaning off the fossil fuel, the dirty energy and all of that. But at some point, they had to go back to coal, which shouldn't be in conversations at this time, going by the climate change messages that have been going on and all.
Coal is well, we know about coal. As you said, it is dirty.
It's the dirtiest.
But it's also called black gold. Yeah, so thank you, Ini. And more from Ini Jamekwa on Business Morning after this program, so please stay tuned for that. Finally, the Athletes Commission of the Ukrainian Figure Skating Federation has called on the sport's international governing body to support a full ban against Russian figure skaters and officials until the end of the Ukrainian invasion. Figure skater Anna Nichankova, chair of the Ukrainian Athletes Commission, says Russia's participation in any status or form in events sanctioned by the International Skating Union was unacceptable. In the wake of the invasion, most international sports federations, including the ISU, adopted recommendations by the International Olympic Committee, IOC, to ban athletes from Russia and Belarus. But in March, IOC issued new guidelines for a gradual return to international competitions by Russian and Belarusian athletes as neutrals. IOC President Thomas Bach says their participation works despite the war in Ukraine. And that's where we leave it on today's edition of our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you so much for watching. Please join us again tomorrow for a fresh edition.